This is just going to be a quick overview of the PlayStation 5 DualSense controller, as well as everything you need to know about using the DualSense controller with a PC gaming setup. So firstly, I'm going to compare it to the DualShock 4 controller from the PlayStation 4. This is definitely larger and definitely slightly heavier. That's not really a problem, other than the fact that the size is a little bit difficult to get used to, and has also meant that they have spread these buttons out here, which I find a little bit annoying because it's a little bit of a reach from the analog stick to like over here now, and you can't really sort of bridge the buttons as you used to quite as easily. Other than that, the main differences between this and the DualShock 4 controller are the hardware additions they've made, namely the adaptive triggers and the haptic feedback in the vibration. Because this is about PC gaming setups with the PlayStation 5 controller, I will say right now that as of the 12th of the 11th, which is when I'm recording this, neither of these features are supported by Steam. In fact, there's less support for the PlayStation 5 controller currently by Steam than the PlayStation 4 had, because at least with the 4 you could set up a PlayStation 4 button map and customize things like the light bar that used to be on the front of the PlayStation 4 controller. With the DualSense controller from the PlayStation 5, because they have yet to release a map, which I'd be very surprised if they didn't, but because it doesn't yet exist, you can't customize anything other than the normal gamepad buttons, your D-pad, your analog stick, your triggers, etc. That every gamepad shares. Those are the only things that you can customize and use with Steam and Steam games. Because a map does not exist, this controller is completely alien to Steam, so it does have to be set up manually. I will go through how to do that later on. But going over the actual controller and its feel, other than the size and the buttons being spaced out and the slight addition to the weight, the triggers feel very good, which I would expect because it's one of their latest hardware innovations. The bumpers, however, whilst they're bigger, which I like, they have a very, very audible click. They're very tactile, which is nice, but they have a very, very audible click, which I'm not a fan of. The D-pad hasn't changed in 1,000 years. That's just never going to change. All the buttons are still joined together. You can see they all move as you press one of them together. Other than the fact that it's now see-through like all the buttons are, which is kind of cool, but it's just a cosmetic feature. There's been no change on the D-pad. Buttons, as I said, are further spaced out and feel as buttons have always felt. That tactile feel in the bumpers is also present in the share and menu buttons, but because it's smaller, they're not quite as loud, and I kind of prefer those. The trackpad, I can't comment on its responsiveness or anything like that, but the button behind it feels fine. The light bars are featured down the side, and if I plug it into my PC, you'll see them light up the same way that it would if it was charging, because obviously it is, and they light up here, which I think is better than on the front, because obviously as the player you can see it. The PlayStation button is now just it's not a circular button like the PlayStation 4 had it. It's actually sort of outlined, and that is the button. It's got quite a deep travel and no tactileness to it, and now I've pissed it off because it's trying to find a PlayStation 5, which I don't own. Beneath that is a quite tactile and loud, and I presume supposed to be lit up when used, microphone mute button. Again, for the PC players, this doesn't work to my knowledge, because I noticed in Assetto Corsa this is a mappable button, so you can use this for other things, and I assume because it's a mappable input that we'll be able to get third-party support, if not Steam support, on mapping this to mute microphones or whatever you want it to do, etc. Onto the analog sticks. Again, analog sticks, much like the D-pad, haven't changed in 1,000 years. The click feels fine. I find the edges, if you use an analog stick like me, which is probably the wrong way, and you push from sort of the bottom or something and click, I can imagine that's going to really hurt after a while. But other than, I mean, they're analog sticks, so there isn't much to say about the analog sticks. I will go over the inputs on all the axes later on. I used Assetto Corsa to record how good the sort of responsiveness of the triggers and the analog stick axes are, whether there's sort of any wrongly set up dead zones in them. So I'll go over that later on in the video. But that's pretty much it for the DualSense PlayStation 5 controller. Next, for the Steam players, I'm going to go over setting this up for use within Steam. I'm going to use Rocket League to demonstrate it working, and to set it up we're going to use Steam Big Picture. So we're going to go on to how to set that up for Steam and Rocket League. Okay, so first thing I should point out for the PC players is if you're going to buy the controller without a PlayStation 5, you're not going to get the USB-C wire. You can set this up through Bluetooth if you have Bluetooth for your PC. My PC does not have Bluetooth, so I'm having to use a USB-C to USB-A wire to plug it into my PC. So if you're not getting the PlayStation 5, you're going to need to get a wire to go with the DualSense controller for use with your PC. Now, on to setting it up with Steam Big Picture, and I'm going to use Rocket League to demonstrate this. Okay, so you see I've got my camera set up, I've got it plugged in, and it's got the orange light bars, as you can see. So the controller's plugged in. First thing I'm going to mention whilst I've just plugged it in is the speaker. Whilst I can't get it to work, it is picked up, as you can see, as a playback device, which I thought was quite interesting, though I couldn't get it to work at max volume. So I don't think that's a supported feature, but Windows will pick it up, and if your Windows is anything like mine, it's going to switch it to that output, and you're going to be left 15 minutes thinking that your headphones don't work anymore. But on to setting up the PlayStation 5 controller, you're going to go to Steam, and once you've got Steam, you're going to go View, and you're going to go Big Picture mode. So once you get presented with this big picture layout, you're going to hit the cog, you're going to go controller settings, and then mine's already set up as a PlayStation 4 controller, but yours will just say wireless controller because it's not yet defined. You'll click that, and it will take you immediately to this layout. Now what you do here, I've already done it, so I can't follow along because I can't get it to not work, but you'll just have to press the button corresponding to whatever it's lit up in green. So that's obviously cross, and then it'll go on to the go back button, which is that one, which is obviously circle, and then triangle, etc. One thing I will point out, because I had a lot of issues with this, is the axes could be a bit of a pain. So obviously left stick X, you want to push it left or right, all the way, and then it will register at that axis. Y obviously up and down, and the same on the other stick. One thing very much worth mentioning is the triggers register as both a axis and a button. One of the issues I came across a lot here was if I squeeze that all the way in, I'm not going to be able to get it to not work now. There you go, button 6, which is obviously not what you want, because you want it to be an axis, because triggers are supposed to return sort of anywhere between not squeezed and fully squeezed, whereas a button will just return a sort of on-off. So to get this to work, to actually register the axes, I sort of half squeeze them. I can't follow along because I can't get it to not register as a button, so I had to back out without saving my changes. I think it's because I've already got it set up, but if you sort of half squeeze it without taking it all the way, I managed to get it to register as axes 3 and 4, which is correct. I've no idea why it also registers as a button. I assume that's got something to do with the adaptive triggers, which hopefully will get solved once we get a map for this from Steam, which I'll imagine they'll do soon. So once you've set all that up, you want to hit save, and you'll get this prompt to share your controller configuration. I would do this just because it lets you select what kind of controller you want it to be. I would set it to a PlayStation 4 because it's the closest thing we've got to a PlayStation 5 controller right now, though when I did this it didn't support the trackpad or the light bar, so it doesn't really make all that much difference, although it does give you the correct button symbols, which I found quite handy. I've already done this, so I'm going to not set that, but then it will come up as a PlayStation 4 controller, as mine does, and then that way, see if you use the controller, as you can see at the bottom, you get the correct symbols popping up to use those. So now that's all set up, as you can see it works absolutely fine. I'm using all the inputs that I've already set up on Rocket League. back when I played with a PlayStation 4 controller. As you can see from the button prompt in the bottom left, my Rocket League thinks I'm using an Xbox controller. This is because I have a custom setup for Rocket League with Steam to change the dead zone shape on the left analog stick, which is just something that I sort of like to do. So you won't get this if you just use the default setup. It's just that if you make any controller changes using Steam, then it just sort of sets your controller up as a sort of generic gamepad, and therefore most games will give you the Xbox button prompts like mine's done here. But one thing to note is that my light bar is still just appears to be charging, so it's just orange right now. But all the buttons work fine and sort of as you would expect. So the last thing I want to do for you guys is go over the dead zones and such on all the axes. I'm going to use Assetto Corsa to do that. So as you can see in the bottom left here, there's a wireless controller window which has all the possible inputs of this controller listed, and we can see things like the axes register. So 1 and 2 are the X and Y axes of the left analog stick. So 1 is the X axis, 2 is the Y axis, 3 is the X axis of the right stick, and 6 for whatever reason is the Y axis of that right stick. The 4th and 5th axes, if I activate them with triggers, are the left and right triggers. So axis 4 is the left trigger, axis 5 is the right trigger. You can see that's also setting off those buttons 7 and 8, which we had problems with when setting up the map. Again, I think that's because of the adaptive trigger setup. I'm not entirely sure. Axes 7 and 8, I have less than no idea what those are all about. I'd love to say they're about the 6 axis, but I have absolutely no clue. So starting with the left analog stick, if I push that all the way to the left, obviously I get 100% reading from axis 1 to its negative value. The dead zone on that seems pretty tight to the edge. If I back off a bit, you won't be able to pick this up on camera, but if I back off the edge of the analog stick just a tad, it more or less immediately starts registering less on that axis. As you can see, if I do that the same on the other side, it is more or less immediately not 100%. So I'm pretty confident that the calibration on the x-axis of the left analog stick is pretty spot on. Moving on to the y-axis of the left analog stick, there's a tiny bit of travel from letting off of the wall and then backing off before that axis sort of starts to register that we're pushing it less, and I think that is definitely noticeable on the bottom of that analog stick axis. So there's a little bit of sort of poorly calibrated dead zone at the bottom, but it's nothing major. So if I go all the way to the bottom and sort of back off a little bit, it takes a little bit of travel before it starts registering less than 100%. You can see right now, and I've had this a couple times already, the third axis, which is the x-axis on the right analog stick, kind of just sits here and has a tiny fit. So I think that's a tiny bit too sensitive, but most games will have what you call it is stop now. Most games will have a dead zone where it doesn't really do anything if it picks up tiny adjustments, sort of like that kind of twitch. So that shouldn't be too much of a problem. The dead zone again is very tight to that wall. There isn't really any travel between coming off the wall and the axis registering less than 100%. As for the right side, more or less exactly the same story, very little travel. The number 6 axis is the y-axis on that right analog stick. So if I back off a very tiny bit, it almost immediately comes back from registering 100%, which is good. And at the bottom, I think we've kind of got the same issue that I had on the left analog stick. There's a little bit of dead zone in there before it starts registering less than 100%, so there's a tiny bit of travel on the bottom. That's not too bad, I'm not too bothered by that. The issue I did have was the triggers. Now the trigger axis I wasn't sort of that impressed with. I don't know why this is, but 100% is registered. I don't know if this is going to come up very well on camera, but 100% is registered from there, and I've still got a good amount of travel left. I assume this is either because of wear in the triggers, because when I was running a PlayStation 4 controller, I had to actually change the top end dead zones down by a lot because none of my triggers registered 100% anymore. They only went up to about 70% registry, even when you fully squeezed it. So I'm wondering if they've backed the triggers off so that they register 100% a lot sooner so that we don't get that issue, or that they wear a lot slower, or it might have something to do with this whole adaptive trigger setup and what the defaults of the controller are that we can't yet change with PC. But either way, 100% registers a lot sooner, and I don't like the fact that it triggers a button. As you can see, number 7 activates on the left and number 8 activates on the right. I'm not a fan of that. It's the same on both triggers. There's a sort of huge gap from 100% to the back of the controller. You see I can do this sort of slight wiggle without making the axis register anything less than 100%. I guess I'd prefer that than sort of 100% not registering at all, which is the issue I had before I replaced my PlayStation 4 controller with the PlayStation 5 controller, but still a bit of a bummer. And obviously all the buttons register perfectly fine. Another thing I want to point out is the microphone mute button is actually activating button 15, so I'm pretty sure this is a mappable button in more or less everything. This actually makes a lot of sense because if you had a headset plugged into the console, then you'd obviously want this microphone mute button to still work, but that means that that microphone mute button is not handled internally in the controller, and until we get good support on the PC, that doesn't yet do anything unless you manually map it yourself, which, as we saw in big picture, it doesn't seem like there's a command, it doesn't seem like there's a button space for an extra button within Steam. Obviously Assetto here has picked it up, so it's quite possible to map it in quite a few games, I imagine. And obviously if we get third-party software or even PlayStation or Steam software that supports the controller itself, then we might even see the functionality of the microphone mute on the controller come to PC. But that is more or less it. So to sum it all up, the controller's bigger, buttons are more spaced out, triggers feel great, bumpers feel crap. Trackpad, light bar, microphone mute button, and the additional hardware features of the adaptive triggers and the haptic feedback aren't yet supported on PC. I'd be very surprised if we don't see Steam support for this controller within a matter of weeks, or at the very least getting third-party open source software that supports the controller and its extra features. But as of recording this, which is the 12th of November, there aren't yet any maps or software or anything to support the PlayStation 5 beyond its basic gamepad capabilities that it shares with pretty much every gamepad ever, its basic buttons. So I hope you found this video very helpful. If you did, please support the video. And if you have any questions, please let me know. I'll try my best to answer them.